Adrian, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you very much indeed for asking me.
And I'm bringing you rapidly into the 21st century because I've got you on video, which is fantastic.
Hey!
Yay, and on a podcast. Yay, yay. So listen, I know you, and you've been described as one of the most productive psychologists in the world. I mean, I'm wondering if you are the most productive by now because you've written so much. You're such a great writer. How do
Hmm.
you manage to do that?
Well, I worked out a long time ago which time of the day I'm at my most productive. So I'm a morning person, a chronic morning person. So from 5 until 10, I do all my productive work. And I get the shakes unless I've written 1,000 words a day. And of course, 1,000 words a day mounts up quite quickly. So that's part of the explanation. I also like seeing my name in various typefaces. So that might account.
Now, there's a psychological theory behind that, I'm sure, which we might have to delve into. But wow, that's amazing, 1,000 words a day. 5 o'clock for most people is still the middle of the night. But
Mm.
anyway, so psychology is an enormous area. It's a
Mm.
subject. Which part is your favourite? What is the thing that excites you most?
Well, I suppose it's called applied psychology. I'm interested in a lot of the theories, but it's the application of the theories to the real world. A few years ago, I did some work for a consultant, which was terribly interesting. And I was an academic, and I had all the theory, but I had not much explanation or application of that theory. So having done some work with him, I became fascinated applying the theory to the world, particularly to managers, the selection and um, training of managers have always been my topic of interest.
Fantastic. And you describe yourself as a well-adjusted workaholic. Is that
Hmm.
really, is that honestly really possible?
Well, I don't have any other hobbies other than my work. Well, I do travel a lot. I quite enjoy travel in the theatre. But some people, long to leave work to go and do something, go swimming or go playing something. I'm not like that. I think work is my passion, which means, of course, I don't work at all because my work is my hobby. And I quote Noel Coward, who said that work is more fun than fun.
Yeah, no, I totally get you, and I can get that. I understand that. And at the beginning of this chat, I alluded to the fact that you're not a great fan of technology. And now that I've
Mm.
got you, and you have to answer my questions, you know what I'm going to ask you about. I'm going to ask you about what is your phobia with mobile phones?
Well, I was trying to explain that the other day. I don't like phones. It's not mobile phones. I don't like telephone calls. And it could be due to the fact that when I was my parents were very poor. My mother was a missionary, so we didn't have a telephone. We had a party line. Are you too young to know what a party line is? What it essentially means is that a lot of people are on the same telephone call, and so when you picked up the phone, if other people didn't put down the phone, they could hear all your conversations. And my parents became themselves a bit phobic about telephones. And then, of course, a telephone was an expensive thing to have. So from a very early age, I learned that telephones weren't very helpful, very expensive, very unpleasant objects. And I've continued that for the rest of my life with mobiles and whatever the opposite of mobiles are, stationary phones. So I guess I'm just not a telephone person. I love my iPad, I love my email, but I don't like telephones
Yeah,
of
no,
any.
absolutely. Yes, no, I know. It's interesting. It's fascinating how that stuck with you. And I do remember that at home when if I was on the phone, my parents could pick up the other line and say, "Get off! You've been on there too long. Do you know how much this is costing us?" So I do remember that. So it's probably fairly similar. So let's go deeper though into business and let's talk about
Hmm.
one of the areas that you talk about extensively, which is fascinating, in that hugely talented people can fail and
Hmm.
ultimately derail.
Hmm.
Can you explain to me what derailment means and how this happens?
Well, I usually begin a lecture on this topic by asking people how many American CEOs are in prison, which is a good starter. How many do you think American CEOs in prison? And I'm a bit out of date with my statistics, but it's about 30 to 40. So these are people who have been highly selected to be in charge of very important companies, and they've got it wrong. They've got it seriously wrong. They've been sacked. They've been sent to prison. A lot of them are sacked. In fact, the statistics are quite surprising. Nearly a half of those who are appointed to senior management positions fail and derail. I think there are two types of failure. One is that they're not competent enough. They don't have enough of some quality that you want. They're not brave enough, insightful enough, clever enough, not emotionally intelligent enough. And there are those who fail because they've got too much of something. And the too much of something is usually associated with what are called the personality disorders. And the ones you would have heard about are narcissism and psychopath. Now, if you look at our current leaders today, some people might say that they could be a little prone to narcissism, and some of them aren't too certain about where the difference between right and wrong is. Now, the issue that I've noticed is that when people get selected to managerial positions, people spend a lot of effort to try to find these people, but they make three mistakes. The first one is they look for qualities they want. They look for these things called competencies, and whatever the company has as their particular profile, they look for that. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, except that's always selecting in. They're always looking for the good things. Nobody's looking for the bad things. There's also things you should select out for. There should be things you are looking for that you don't want. You know, this is partly, for me, a description of why the divorce statistics are so high, because we spend a lot of effort finding the things we do want, but never considering the things we don't want. So that's point number one, that we don't select out. Nobody seems to be there. I do this for some organizations. I'm there as the select out man. I'm looking for the dark side. I'm looking for the things that potentially lead to derailment, like being a psychopath or being a narcissist or being schizotypal or whatever. The second feature is that people think there's a logical relationship, a linear relationship between a quality and an outcome. The more of something, the better. The more attractive you are, the more intelligent you are, the more courageous you are. And that's simply not true. If you take something we all know about, like OCD or perfectionism, what we want is people to be detail-oriented. We want them to be careful. Where's the line between that and OCD? So when you see a desirable characteristic, one of the things that people don't seem to understand is that you can have too much of a good thing. So the first thing is looking for select out. The other is this issue around optimal rather than maximal. And then there's people's adaptability to change. The word agile is very sexy at the moment. And so I think lots of leaders fail and derail. And how do you measure that? You can see the share price goes down, people leave, they miss opportunities, they're thought of as not empowering, they're not thought of as not warm, they're not very humble individuals, because nobody has thought about these three issues: selecting out, optimality, and agility.
That's brilliant. I'm going to make a note of those, because I'm engaged now. So
I'm going
to check that.
You've got to check your dark side of your young man. Indeed, I think that's a wise thing to do. Maybe I should come around to tea and do it for you.
Yes, I think I might invite you over as a consultant. And you mentioned change
yes.
in your response. Do people change much over time, would you say?
That's the $44,000 question. I was recently at a school reunion. I don't know if you've been to a school reunion, but you must go, because the question is, you believe you've changed. We've become more intelligent and perspicacious and insightful, but they have got wider, wrinklier, and grayer. That's the only way in which they change. Well, there's a big debate on this issue at the moment. It's called the plaster versus the plastic hypothesis. And the plaster people say, we're set in plaster. What you see is what you get. Age 25, you're not going to get brighter or more, not going to change much at all. Whereas the other side say, no, this is nonsense. We've got now more evidence from the brain sciences of people changing, of them being more adaptable. Now, I tend to be more of a plaster than a plastic person. I think, by the age of 25 or whatever, you said you're not going to get any brighter, you're not going to get any taller. Are your motives likely to change? I think if you're bright, and I think if you're hungry and curious, and you want to learn, it's the joke about the psychologist. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is, well, only one, but the light bulb needs to want to be changed. So it's the question is, to what extent are you in this business of learning? And the great issue for many organizations, I was on a call 2 minutes ago about giving a big talk on change, and organizations are worried about changing individuals, changing teams and groups, particularly boards, and changing the organization as a whole. The trouble with the word change is that it has two emotions associated with it: boredom and anxiety. because you've heard, oh no, not change again, and oh my God, we've got to change. It means everything's going to be disturbed. So it's a difficult thing to talk about. But I talk about progress, I talk about business, and the question is, are you an optimist or a pessimist about changing times? In 2008, when the economy went badly down, of my friends, my consultant friends, half of them had the best year they'd ever had, and half of them had the worst. And I think changing times provides opportunities. They provide opportunities, disruption. I say to people, how to prove that you're a young person, you've got to say the D words: disruptive, digital, and diversity. Those are the three big Ds are going on at the moment. But I think in a time of change, a time of technological change, a time of demographic change, there are opportunities to do stuff. And you can see some people relish these times, whereas others are really frightened of them. And I think as the older you get, the more powerful, the more set in your ways, you tend to be more frightened of change than relish it.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. So I don't know, the plaster versus plastic, that's interesting. I thought it was going to be something to do with cosmetic surgery, but
well, it could well be. I think what you get with plastic surgery is cosmetic change rather than fundamental change.
So the other question is regarding change. I mean, I think that motivation changes over time, and what motivates you change. I mean, I know that I was motivated by different things in my 20s than in my 30s than in my 40s. I'm going to stop counting now. I'm not going to go down now. And do you agree? Does motivation change for people?
Well, this is a difficult one. I think, as a psychologist, we measure three things with individuals. We measure their abilities. We're quite good at that. That's quite robust, quite firm. We can measure their personality. But the trouble with motivation is not that people won't tell you, but they can't tell you. That they don't have the insight into the matter. You've got friends and I've got friends, and they're deeply motivated by all sorts of things which they really don't have the insight into. Other people tell you how competitive you are, or how keen you are on money, or things that are associated with physical objects. I think no is the answer to your question. I think motivation doesn't change. I think you might become aware of your motives. It could be, one argument would be that you have a motive for something, and then you get that something. You have a motive for being rich, and once you attain a certain amount of money, then that motive changes. The trouble with that is I've never met anybody who's been motivated by money to say they've got enough. It seems as if you never got enough money. And, one is motivated by happiness. Well, how do you define that? So my answer is, I think your motives might get more complex, and one might become more apparent than another. But I think, you don't change much over time, motivation-wise, unless you've had, some people have had trauma or therapy or something which has really shaken up their lives. Under those circumstances, I think sometimes you do see this. You see a complete reevaluation where something has gone wrong, and it usually makes or breaks people. I've been fascinated by the princes. I'm writing my next book, my 93rd book, Maria, 7 to go, is on the biography of leaders. And one of the things we know is a huge number of very successful leaders have lost a parent early in life. It can be nothing as traumatic or as unhappy making as the loss of a parent. But if you have had this experience and you've got through it, then my goodness, are you going to be resilient, because you've been through the darkest night of the soul and you've recovered. Therefore, nothing after that can be so terrible. So I'm interested in how early experiences, and in this sense, they can change motives, that you have an experience which fundamentally shakes you up, shakes the whole system. That might lead to motivation. But in general, I don't think people's motives change greatly over time.
That's fascinating. That's interesting. So I'm going to sort of, analyze myself a bit more and think, actually, have they, or is it's probably just that I've matured a bit, maybe.
Ask don't introspect. Ask your friends. Ask your long-term friends, people you've known for years and years and years, in what way they think you have changed in terms of your motives. They will be more, I think, perspicacious. We are not always the best judges of our motives. They're difficult for us to explain often.
Interesting. So you touched on money and happiness. And I mean, you're saying that people who are motivated by money never seem to have enough money. So is money not a good motivator then?
I always say three things. First of all, you've got to pay people what are called market forces. So pay them enough and pay them fairly. But beyond that, money is not a very powerful motivator. You know, there's a book called Drive by a chap called Daniel Pink. And he talks about intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the joy of the activity. People say, I work hard. I say, nonsense, I don't work hard because it's not work, it's play for me. And I always illustrate this by a little story of a friend of mine who had a problem working at home with children playing outside. And the question was, they were in a park, and how do you get rid of these children playing in the park? Well, you could bribe them to go away. You could play music they didn't like. You could put in double glazing. My friend was very, very clever. He went into the park and said, children, I'm going to give you money to carry on playing. I'm going to give you play money. And they were a bit surprised by this. They took the money. And the next day he came back, gave them more money. And there's a few more. It's getting a bit costly. But on the third day he went to the park. He said, children, I'm sorry, I can't give you any money. I've run out. I don't have any. Well, they said, if you think we're going to carry on here playing for money, we're off. You've turned play into work. It's preposterous to pay people to play. Now, the question is, the more workers like play, the more enjoyable, the more intrinsically motivated, the better. So I say to people with regard to money, number one of the problems with money is the effect wears off. If you got a huge increase in salary today, how long would that effect last? 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, couple of weeks? So if you're going to use money as a motivator, you need a lot of it. Number two, I've just finished an article this morning. My 1,000 words this morning was on the topic of pay secrecy. And that is whether you are allowed to, or whether you should be encouraged to share how much you earn in the company. And you know, if you've been in an organization where salaries are open, it causes a lot of stuff, because we know the single best predictor of a person's satisfaction with their salary is not how much they get, but how much they get relatively. And to sit at work with some chap sitting next to you, or some person sitting next to you who's getting 1p more than you a year is deeply infuriating, because it's unfair. It's the F word. So it's not how much people are paid, it's how much they're paid relatively. And the final point is, what are the alternatives? So when I'm with a big group, I was with a very big group of grown-ups last week in Lausanne, and I said to them, well, I'm going to make you an offer. I'm going to offer you £5,000 in cash or a week's extra holiday. What do you want? And of course, most of them will take a week. So I'll say, all right, 8,000. I'll take a week. So I'll say 10,000. And so I'm trading off money for time. Which do you really want? And what you discover is a lot of very senior people, they're well paid, but they don't have the time they want to spend that money. So what is deeply motivating? What is motivating is a job where you have autonomy. You can do the things that you're good at and like doing, and that you believe is important. Now that will compensate for large sums of money. And you've worked with people, and I work with people, extremely wealthy people. They're not particularly happy. And also, the really interesting thing is when they stop work, how their lives fall to pieces. The fantasy of spending your life on the golf course or whatever very soon dries up. If you enjoy what you do, thinking you're making a contribution, speak to your strengths, that's good enough. You need enough money, there's no doubt about that. More money is always good for you, but to chase the money, you're chasing a false god.
Fantastic. That's a masterclass in an answer there, Adrian. That's amazing. So I'm going to challenge you now on something else here, because I think you were talking about the different pay scales. And of course, there's a lot of talk about, gender pay gaps. In your experience, are men better at negotiating their salaries than women?
Yes, much better. Because of chutzpah, because they're more vain. They've got more hubris. What women do is they always negotiate on behalf of their team as opposed to themselves. And I think, it's this competitiveness, this slightly assertiveness is a masculine trait. And we know from study after study that women are much more prone to humility and males to hubris. So they feel it's not very feminine, it's not very appropriate to go and ask for a raise. I do, however, think this is changing, and I think it's changing relatively fast, particularly where you meet moderately medium to senior people, particularly in the city, they worked out that the way you get on is behave like a male, and males ask for raises and they don't feel bad about it or whatever. But there have been a number of papers on, how women negotiate slightly differently from men. They use a different style. And sometimes that style works, sometimes not. I think to ask for and to get evidence for why you deserve a raise or why you deserve promotion, I think is something that everybody's got to do. Now, the question is, should you try and make men less arrogant and more humble, or women more hubristic? I don't know. I think they both could learn from each other.
I've made some notes there, although I am my own boss, so I'm quite.
I know.
It's not good to negotiate with myself. So, I mean, there's so many topics that you can cover and that are relevant to business. One of the other ones is culture. I wonder, you've mentioned to me in the past culture shock. Can you explain that for me?
It was my first book and one of my most successful books. And it's a concept that comes from anthropology. Those people listening to me can hear that I'm a foreigner. I didn't grow up in England. I grew up in deepest, darkest Africa. And when I came to England, although my parents were English, it was rather a shock. It wasn't exactly as I thought it would be. I thought England would be like the world of Noel Coward. It turned out rather different from that. And it's about, when you move from one country to another, you experience shock. There's a surprise about people not being different. You suddenly, there's a sense of loss. You miss your friends. There's sometimes a sense of indignation about people doing things very differently. Sometimes you feel rejected by the native culture. You feel infantilized. You can't negotiate things. You can't speak the language. You can't work out the change. Now, that's what we talk about by culture shock, usually associated with going from one country to another. But you experience the same thing from going from one organization to another. Organizations some of them have very strong corporate cultures. It hits you as you walk in. The funny way that the people talk, the little rules that they all obey that nobody seems to mention. And, when I go into organizations, I say, well, if you've been in an organization more than a year, you think your behavior is normal. But it isn't. Let's talk to the people who've been here only about 4 or 5 months and the funny and peculiar things that you've noticed. And we become immune to the patterns of behavior that we pay attention to. And so many organizations are very interested in trying to change the culture. I think one of the easiest ways to change the culture is physically move. If you move physically, it disrupts relationships and all sorts of patterns, the water coolers in a different place, the kitchens in a different place. And it gives you an opportunity to start again, to rethink things, because we get into patterns of behavior. And particularly where there are these unspoken rules. You have to break the rules to know what the rules are, that you can't use somebody's mug, or this is a topic we don't talk about, or nobody goes there. And you notice that, in boardrooms, particularly with men, there are topics they won't go near. They won't talk about emotions, and they won't talk about certain things that you can express. You can express anger, but you can't express sadness. And these become corporate cultural rules, which sometimes are adaptive, but in most part are maladaptive, which is why people call in consultants to do exactly this, to try and take part or help them in corporate culture change.
Wow, you see, another masterclass in an answer. I could talk to you all day, but we've rapidly run out of time. And there's always a question I like to ask my speakers. And we've been working together for some time, so I know you've been speaking for some time. So, Adrian, I want to take you into my time machine. Knowing what you know now and the experience you've had up to now as a speaker and presenter, what advice would you give young Adrian starting out? It's a tough question.
Yes, it is. As being a speaker,
yes.
What I know is that people like stories. Now, you can call them stories. You can call them case studies. You can call them parables. What people is they remember stories. And I say to people, particularly if I'm doing a big lecture course or a 3-hour, I say the criteria of success is what you will remember in 2 weeks. What will you remember from all this in 2 weeks? And what are you going to do differently? and they do remember the stories. What you have to do is link the story to a proverb or an outcome or whatever. So it's all very well, you know, doing the 3 things of this or the 7 things of the other. But unless you provide rich examples of them. So the first thing I would say is tell stories. Now, the trouble is with younger people, they don't have the experiences, they don't have the stories. Older people will tell the stories because they've actually had the life experience. But you can tell stories on behalf of other people. Secondly, I think, because I do it, I suppose, I use humor. I think humor works. It doesn't work with everybody. I get into trouble with my humor. I cross too many boundaries, perhaps. But to make people feel comfortable, to make them feel receptive. And thirdly, don't feel frightened to touch emotions. You know, we are people of the head and people of the heart. And if you look at the great speeches of all time, if you look at Obama and you look at Churchill and you look at Lincoln, what's interesting about them is the way in which they touch the heart. You know, the great speeches are linked. They're more about emotions than they're about cognitions. And if you want people to sit up, then tweak their heartstrings, go to the emotions as much as the cognitions. Now, people say, oh, well, we paid a lot of money for a speaker to tell us how to do that. Yes, I understand this, but there's always an emotional association with it. I work in the city at the moment, and you know, there's this thing called behavioral economics. And suddenly the economists have been very surprised by the fact that we're not rational people, as everyone said. We are not logical, we are psychological, that we are people of the head and people of the heart. So let me summarize. Number 1, tell people parables and stories that they remember. 2, don't be frightened of going to the emotions. In fact, don't use emotions, use the emotions of the room, use emotions to make people link ideas together. And where you can, make people feel relaxed through humor. That's what I tell the young Adrian.
And it's exactly what you do. Adrian, thank you so much.
Maria, thank you. It's been wonderful.